The storm loomed over the Seattle skyline, dark clouds rolling in as thunder echoed in the distance, a warning of things to come. Inside my waterfront estate, the city's most powerful gathered, their quiet conversations laced with unspoken deals and power plays. It was my 38th birthday, and the air carried the weight of influence. This was a room full of people who shaped the city, but tonight, they were here for me. The grand chandelier cast a golden glow over the marble floors, illuminating a world I had built from the ground up. Every detail was perfect, just as I intended. My name, Michael Carter, meant something in this city. I had spent years turning Carter Security Solutions into an empire, making it the most sought-after firm for private and corporate security. I had learned early that power wasn't about wealth, it was about control. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations with the ease of a man who had mastered the art of command. My tailored black suit fit like armor, emphasizing the disciplined physique of someone who spent as much time in the gym as in the boardroom. People respected me. Some feared me. But no one doubted that I always got what I wanted. The Kingston contract was a stroke of genius, remarked James Whitmore, a high-level executive from Titan Tech. He forced a smile, but I saw the unease in his eyes. Taking it from Sentinel Security? That was bold. They made promises they couldn't keep, I replied, my tone even. I don't make promises. I deliver results. James nodded quickly, shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. That was the effect I had on people. A moment later, Nathan Wallace, my head of security, approached with 2 glasses of whiskey. "Perimeter secure, sir," he said in a low, measured voice, handing me a glass. "We had to turn away some press, though. Your brother's latest situation has caught attention." My grip tightened on the glass. Daniel, the walking disaster who carried our last name like a burden instead of a privilege. Another mess to clean up, another scandal staining our family's reputation. This time, it was about unpaid gambling debts to the kind of people who didn't send polite reminders. The crowd shifted, and then I saw her. Emily. She moved through the room with effortless grace, her emerald green dress shimmering under the chandelier's light. Even after 15 years of marriage, she could still turn heads. But something was different tonight. She reached me, slipping her arm through mine in that well-practiced way, her smile warm but not quite reaching her eyes. I could feel the tension in her fingers, the way her grip on my wrist was just a little too tight. "The Hendersons want to discuss security for their daughter's wedding," she said lightly. I let her lead me toward them, playing my role as the dutiful husband. But my mind was elsewhere, picking up on the small things. The way she kept glancing at her phone. The slight tremor in her fingers when she reached for her wine glass. The hesitation before she laughed at a joke. Something was wrong. And then the first real disruption of the night came. A shift in the room, a ripple in the carefully controlled atmosphere. I didn't need to turn around to know who had arrived. "Happy birthday, big brother," came a voice, too loud, too casual, cutting through the polished conversations like a dull blade. I turned, and there he was, Daniel Carter. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, his grin too wide, his eyes bloodshot and gleaming with something that wasn't quite amusement. He smelled like scotch and regret. "You're late," I said, my voice giving nothing away. "Traffic was murder," he shrugged. Then his gaze slid past me and landed on Emily. And then, his smile changed. It was subtle. A shift in his expression. A flicker in his eyes. And then I saw something I shouldn't have seen. The way Emily's posture stiffened for just a second before she forced a smile. The way she inhaled, too quickly, too sharply, before she spoke. "There's my favorite sister-in-law," Daniel said, stepping forward. Emily laughed, but it was off. Just a little too bright. A little too forced. And in that moment, something settled in my gut. Something cold. Something sharp. I had spent my life knowing things before they happened, predicting every move before it was made. And yet, watching them, watching the way she hesitated, the way his eyes lingered, I realized I had missed something. Something was very, very wrong. The party carried on, a carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and influence. But beneath the polite conversations and clinking glasses, my mind was working through the details, subtle shifts, hidden tensions. Emily had always been poised, always knew how to play her part in these circles. And yet, she was slipping tonight. The way she glanced at Daniel, the way her smile didn't quite hold, the nervous flick of her fingers against the stem of her wine glass. It was all wrong. I watched as she excused herself, slipping through the crowd with a grace that should have been effortless. Instead, it looked practiced, rehearsed. Daniel was doing his own performance, laughing too loud, drinking too much. But beneath his casual arrogance, there was something else, something calculated. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Nathan Wallace, my head of security, had been keeping a careful eye on everything. He was discreet, but I caught the way he was tracking Emily's movements, the way his sharp eyes followed Daniel's path across the room. He moved to my side, his voice low. "Something's off." I nodded once, sipping my whiskey. "I know. Want me to pull the security feed for the last few weeks?" he asked, not bothering to mask the edge in his voice. Nathan wasn't just an employee. He had been with me since the beginning. He knew when something didn't sit right. "Send them to my office," I said smoothly, keeping my expression neutral. "All of them." He gave a slight nod before melting back into the crowd, disappearing the way good security should. I turned my attention back to the room, scanning for Emily. She was lingering near the kitchen entrance, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. Her phone was still in her hand, her grip tight around it. I wasn't a man prone to paranoia. I didn't need to be. My success came from knowing everything before anyone else did. And right now, I didn't know. That was a problem. Daniel, however, was a problem I knew well. He had been a burden my whole life. The reckless younger brother who thrived on making mistakes, knowing I'd be the one to clean them up. He had coasted on our last name, racking up debts, gambling, making enemies in places he had no business being. And yet, there was something different tonight. He wasn't just playing the fool. He was watching. Waiting. When Emily turned back toward the party, Daniel was there, already moving in her direction. He placed a hand on her lower back, his touch lingering just a second too long. She startled slightly before covering it with a laugh. A forced laugh. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I wasn't a man who reacted emotionally. I didn't believe in rage-fueled decisions. No, my strength came from patience. From planning. From waiting until my enemies thought they had the upper hand before I destroyed them completely. If what I suspected was true, I would need to be perfect. I set my drink down and adjusted my cuffs. "Wallace," I murmured into my earpiece. "I want a full security analysis. Track Emily's movements for the last 6 months. Cross-reference with Daniel's known locations." There was a brief pause. Then a simple, "Understood." Across the room, Daniel caught my eye and smirked. He lifted his glass in a mock toast before taking a slow sip. I simply smiled back. Let him think he had won something tonight. Let him think I hadn't already started planning his downfall. The party wound down as midnight approached, the sound of rain intensifying against the tall windows of my estate. Most of the guests had filtered out, leaving behind empty glasses and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. The air felt heavier now, the carefully maintained illusion of celebration peeling away as reality settled in. I sat in my study, the leather chair cool against my back, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand, my tablet in the other. Nathan had been efficient, as always. The screen before me displayed security footage spanning the last 6 months, compiled, analyzed, time-stamped. I scrolled through it, my mind sharp despite the alcohol burning in my throat. Emily and Daniel. Not just at the party tonight. Not just a stolen glance. Patterns emerged. Encounters I hadn't noticed at the time. Moments that, taken individually, might have meant nothing, but put together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. Private meetings when I was out of town. Conversations just out of the camera's reach. The way she smiled at him when she thought no one was watching. And then, a recording from just last week, one that sent ice through my veins. It was in my house. The kitchen. Late at night. Emily walked in first, wearing the silk robe I had bought her for our anniversary. Daniel followed a second later, glancing around like a man who knew he shouldn't be there. And then, the moment that shattered the last piece of doubt in my mind. She reached for him first. Not an accident. Not a moment of weakness. A decision. Her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him toward her, and then she kissed him. Long, familiar. Not new. Not the first time. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening on the tablet as the weight of the betrayal settled over me. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of loyalty. Gone. Destroyed in a single recorded moment. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Michael, it's not what it looks like. But I knew better. My world had been built on certainty, on control. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it. But there it was, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Emily, my wife, had been sleeping with my brother. The betrayal itself was bad enough. But the stupidity of it, the arrogance, that they thought they could do this under my roof, that they thought I wouldn't find out. I set the tablet down, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just personal. This was an insult. Across the room, Nathan stood silently, watching me. He had already seen the footage. He already knew what I would ask next. "Sir," he said carefully, "what do you want to do?" I picked up my whiskey and took another slow sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Then I set the glass down with deliberate precision. "Compile everything," I said, my voice calm. "Every meeting. Every message. Every time they were alone together. I want a full record." Nathan nodded. "Understood." "And Nathan?" "Yes, sir." I met his eyes, my own devoid of emotion. "By morning, I want them both to understand what it means to betray me." The rain outside had turned into a downpour, hammering against the windows as if the storm itself could sense the shift in the air. The house was quiet now. The guests were gone. The staff had retired for the night. Except for Emily. She was still here. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, my bedroom now, watching as she sat at the vanity, her emerald dress slightly wrinkled, her hair no longer as perfectly styled as it had been earlier in the evening. She looked at her reflection, but her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers toyed with her necklace, the same way they did when she was nervous. Good. She had reason to be. Slowly, she noticed me in the mirror, and her shoulders stiffened before she turned. "Michael," she said, trying for a smile. "You disappeared after the party. Is everything okay?" It was almost amusing. The performance. The forced normalcy. I said nothing. Instead, I walked over to the dresser and picked up my tablet. I tapped the screen a few times, bringing up the footage Nathan had compiled. Then I turned the tablet toward her. Her eyes flicked down, and I saw the exact moment she knew. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't even bother trying to deny it. Instead, she whispered, "Michael, I cut her off. Don't. Just don't." She swallowed hard, glancing down at her lap before forcing herself to look at me again. "It's not what you think." I let out a slow, quiet breath. "Really? Because what I think is that my wife has been sleeping with my brother." Her fingers clenched in her lap. "I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed, sharp, humorless. That's the kind of thing people say after they've been caught. "If you didn't want to hurt me, Emily, you wouldn't have done it." Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't interested in her tears. I had seen enough. I had felt enough. "You have 1 hour," I said, my voice controlled, detached. "Pack your personal belongings. Clothes, toiletries, whatever fits in a suitcase. Everything else stays." Her breath hitched. "Michael, please." 1 hour, I repeated. She stood abruptly, shaking her head. "You don't understand. I was lonely. You were always working, always building your company, always somewhere else. And Daniel, Don't say his name," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the air between us. She exhaled shakily, blinking away the tears. "I made a mistake." I studied her carefully, the woman I had spent 15 years of my life with. The woman who had just thrown it all away. "No," I said finally. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is backing into a parked car. You made a choice. And now, you get to live with it." She paled, her hands trembling. "I have nowhere to go." "Not my problem," I said. "Not anymore." Her lower lip quivered, and she stepped forward, reaching for me. Michael, I love you. I stepped back, out of her reach. No, Emily. You love what I gave you. The life I built. The comfort. The status. I shook my head. But me. You didn't love me enough to stay faithful. A sob ripped from her throat. Please. Just give me a chance to fix this. I met her eyes, my expression unreadable. Pack your things, I said. Your time starts now. She realized, then, that this was real. That there was no begging her way out of it. Her tears turned to silent sobs as she rushed to the closet, grabbing clothes, stuffing them into a suitcase with shaking hands. I turned and walked out, leaving her to her choices. Nathan was waiting just outside the bedroom. She'll be gone within the hour, I said. Make sure the staff supervises. I don't want her taking anything that doesn't belong to her. Nathan nodded. And Daniel? I smiled, slow and cold. Oh, he'll get exactly what he deserves. The morning arrived cold and gray, typical of Seattle. By the time I woke, Emily was already gone. Nathan had made sure of it. Through the security feeds, I watched as she stood at the front gates, a single suitcase at her feet. The rain had soaked through her dress, but she didn't seem to notice. She just stood there, staring at the mansion as if expecting it to open for her. As if she still belonged here. She didn't. And she never would again. Eventually, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the city she had once looked down on. I exhaled slowly and turned back to my laptop. The next phase of my plan was already in motion. Emily had been easy to deal with. Daniel, that was going to be much more satisfying. I pulled up the financial records Nathan had compiled. Daniel had always been reckless, but this time I was going to make sure his self-destruction was absolute. First, I had already cut him off. Every account he had access to, frozen. Every investment portfolio, drained. Every safety net, gone. Next, his debts. Daniel owed money to people who didn't send polite letters. People who expected to be paid in full. People who, when denied payment, tended to make examples out of people like my brother. I made sure they knew exactly where to find him. And then, just for good measure, I had Nathan send a few well-placed messages to our business associates. A warning. Anyone who loaned Daniel money, cut him off. Anyone who considered hiring him, don't. Anyone who thought about helping him, think again. By the end of the day, Daniel Carter wasn't just broke. He was poison. And that was when I received the inevitable call. His voice was already desperate. Michael, we need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. Do we? You cut me off, he said, his voice raw with disbelief. You froze my accounts. I can't access anything. My credit cards are getting declined. What the hell, man? I smiled faintly. You always liked to gamble, Daniel. Consider this your final bet. You rolled the dice on my wife. And you lost. A pause. Then, lower, angrier. You can't do this to me. I already did. I heard him exhale sharply, like he was barely holding back his rage. This isn't over. I let out a slow chuckle. Oh, but it is. You just don't know it yet. And with that, I hung up. Daniel had spent his whole life testing boundaries, pushing limits, assuming that no matter how badly he screwed up, I'd always be there to fix it. But this time, there was no fixing this. This time, I wasn't his safety net. This time, I was the reason he was falling. A week had passed. Daniel was drowning. I had made sure of it. The calls had stopped after the first few days. At first, he was angry, threatening, demanding, spitting venom over the phone. But then the desperation set in. His messages turned into pleas, bargains, anything to get me to undo what I had done. I ignored them all. Because Daniel Carter was done. His name, once powerful, now meant nothing. The investors who used to take his calls? They wouldn't return them. The friends who once partied with him? They had distanced themselves, too afraid to be caught in the wreckage. And his debts? Well, I had made sure the right people knew where to find him. He had nowhere left to go. Nowhere but prison. See, Daniel had always been reckless. He thought he could hide his mistakes. He thought he was untouchable. But when you live a life full of bad decisions, eventually, they catch up to you. And with just a few well-placed documents, a couple of anonymous tips to the right authorities, and a financial trail so easy to follow that even an amateur investigator could crack it, Daniel found himself with a new address. A prison cell. 15 years. That was the sentence. And the best part? He had no idea it was me. I sat in the visitor's room, waiting, watching as they brought him in. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. The man who sat across from me wasn't the same Daniel Carter who had walked into my house a week ago, smirking like he had already won. No. This man was broken. He picked up the receiver, his hands still bruised from whatever fights he had already gotten into. You. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Me, I said simply. His fingers clenched the receiver. You did this. I tilted my head slightly. I didn't force you to commit fraud, Daniel. I didn't tell you to rack up millions in debt to some very unpleasant people. I didn't put your name on all those shady financial transactions. His jaw clenched. I leaned forward, my voice low. I just made sure everyone saw what you really are. His breathing was uneven now. His rage had nowhere to go. You think you've won? His voice cracked. I'll get out. You hear me? This isn't over. I smiled faintly. Oh, but it is. I leaned back, taking in the sight of him, memorizing the moment. The fall of Daniel Carter, the brother who had finally learned that actions have consequences. I checked my watch. 15 years is a long time, Daniel. Try to make the most of it. And then, I stood, placing the receiver down gently before walking away without a second glance. By the time I stepped outside, the rain had started again, coating the city in a cold, relentless downpour. Somewhere, miles away, Emily was still out there, too. I had been keeping tabs on her, of course. She was living in a cheap motel now, cycling through low-paying jobs, struggling to survive. The people who had once admired her, invited her to high-profile events, treated her like royalty, they had all vanished. She was alone. She had gambled, just like Daniel had. And she had lost, too. Nathan had asked me once if I wanted to keep monitoring her. If I wanted to finish her off completely. I told him no. Because Emily wasn't worth it. Some people destroy themselves without any help at all. I didn't need to ruin her. She would do that all on her own. I stepped into my car, adjusting the cuffs of my suit as Nathan shut the door behind me. Everything taken care of, sir? He asked. I exhaled slowly, watching the raindrops streak across the tinted window. Yes, I murmured. And for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.